Alright, we are back with a new video, and today I'm doing my episode ranking for Season 9 of MLP Friendship is Magic, the final season of the mainline series. And while many people consider this an improvement over Season 8, I know a lot of people still don't like the season particularly all that much. Although personally, I do find it to be somewhat amusing as it definitely has its share of decent episodes, and I do like the way in which it at least attempts to tie up some loose ends before wrapping up the series. And obviously, the fact that the series even gets a formal ending is something that I do appreciate at the end of the day. But as usual with these rankings, I'll be going through episode by episode, ranking them from worst to best. And with there being 26 episodes, two of them being two parters, that leaves us with 24 episodes to rank here. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 24, the worst episode of season 9 is a notably bad episode from the season, but also the series as a whole. And I do have it at the bottom here, but here we have 246 great. And this is a terrible episode. It is an episode that is both bad, but also really confusing. Now, I kind of understand the moral that they were going for with this episode, where we obviously see Rainbow Dash being sprung upon this responsibility of coaching the cheer squad, like teaching them in order to be great, and her learning this lesson of taking the passion that she applies to her own career of being a Wonderbolt and sort of applying that to things that others want to do in order to elevate them. And I kind of get that in that you can't always do what you want. Sometimes that you need to do things for others. But for me, the way in which this entire episode is set up is pretty arbitrary, where yes, I kind of get that Rainbow Dash has to learn this lesson of like caring for others, doing things for others, and what have you. But I feel like Twilight's decision to make Rainbow Dash the head of the cheer squad is really strange. Now, I get that she didn't want to make her the coach of the actual Buckball team, which she wanted, as obviously you have Pinky, Fluttershy, and Snails here, who are pretty clearly professional Buckball players, so obviously you want them as the coaches. But why couldn't you get like Rarity to be the coach instead? Or why couldn't you get Applejack or literally anyone other than Rainbow Dash, who is so clearly obsessed with the actual sport of Buckball and is so clearly focused on wanting to be the sport? I mean, I guess you could say that like Cheer Squad is kind of like being part of a Wonderbolt, or at least in the episodes where the Wonderbolts are supposed to be a performance group, but obviously those roles tend to be interchanged, so take that as you will. But I still find the actual decision to make Rainbow Dash here the coach to be pretty arbitrary and existing for no other reason than to have her learn this lesson of caring for others. But even going beyond that, there's a whole bunch of strange stuff that happens. Like you have Snip's involvement in the episode, which is just really bizarre, where his whole gimmick in this episode is that he's trying to sell merchandise for the cheer squad. And he literally tries to lecture Rainbow Dash about how they have a vested interest in making sure the cheer squad does well. And that obviously it makes Rainbow Dash look good in the eyes of Twilight, makes her a good coach, makes the other cheer squad members look up to her. But obviously from Stip's end, also increased sales of the merchandise that he has for the cheer squad, which is pretty strange on its own. Like, I don't understand why it was added to the episode, but for whatever reason, the episode seems to kind of overlook Snips' own selfishness here. I mean, it makes it seem like Snips is kind of being victimized here when Rainbow Dash doesn't want to help the cheer squad, like her decision hurts him in some way, and that he just wants the cheer squad to do well, when in reality it's like he's just as selfish as Rainbow Dash, and the fact that they don't really call him out as much is really bizarre to me. And you obviously have Rainbow Dash over the course of the episode, like completely failing and not caring about the cheer squad to the point where it's so obvious that she has to learn this lesson, to the point where she's being outwardly like mean spirited at points. I mean, we had that scene where like the cheer squad practices in front of Twilight and the team, only to obviously have it be a disaster. And then immediately afterwards, she literally tells everyone on the cheer squad, nobody cares about the cheer squad. That's why everyone goes out to get a snack while you're all performing, which is obviously pretty awful. Now, I actually kind of relate to the cheer squad in a lot of ways. Like, I actually did marching band when I was in high school and college, and I kind of relate to that experience of, like us being like a side attraction and people potentially like not paying attention to us even when we're like supposed to be doing our field show and stuff like that. So I kind of relate to that in some way, but it's still really mean spirited. And obviously, we see Jonas reacting to this. We obviously see the other cheer squad members like really like chew her out. And then we get to Smolder's big speech where she really calls her out and saying that I care about Cheer Squad, Twilight cares about Cheer Squad, other people care about Cheer Squad, and I want to see you apply your passion. And I mean, it's pretty cool seeing Smolder like articulate these things, but still very like ham-fisted here. Like the fact that Rainbow Dash is basically forced into this position where clearly from the beginning she probably should not have been put into that position, and it's just a bunch of people berating her over and over again for failing to like effectively do the job. Like it's so clear that she is such a poor fit for this position of helping the cheer squad, but then just other people just keep bashing her over and over again, and in turn Rainbow Dash is like being pretty mean spirited as well. And by the end, I feel like no one's really likable in this situation. I feel like it's sort of a weird conflict with a lot of strange stuff going on, and it's just not an overly fun episode to watch in my opinion. So at the end of the day, I do feel like this is a pretty awful episode, and a lot of people have noted this as being one of the worst episodes in the entire series, which I guess as a spoiler alert for the all-time episode ranking is not a position I disagree with. So for all those reasons, I do feel like this is clearly the worst episode of season 9, and because of that, it is here at number 24. Now we're moving on to number 23, and we have another episode that's pretty bad, although not one that I have as much negative feelings about, but here we have Dragon Dropped here, and this episode is just really bizarre for a lot of it, where a lot of it feels like this role reversal between Rarity and Spike, where now Rarity is the one who's obsessing with Spike to the point where she's literally trying to drive a wedge between him and Gabby for a lot of it. And a lot of it's just not very fun to watch. I find Rarity to be not very likable in this episode. And obviously we see her like basically using Spike for chores. Like we see her like at the beginning at least, like using him in order to collect gems and like run errands and stuff like that. And yes, while we do see her in the middle of the episode try to lure him away by inviting him to all these like conventions and doing stuff that he wants, once we see Gabby get upset with Spike and go away, and we see Spike being pretty miserable, we get that segment of her and Spike basically going on all of Rarity's errands, like which doesn't leave the best taste in my mouth. And obviously, Rarity is also pretty creepy at certain points. Like there's that scene where she literally is standing in his bed and she gives that weird smile to him as she basically tries to lure him away. So there's that. And just in general, this episode's not really fun to watch, if you ask me. Now, I do like how Spike and Gabby become friends and how we see Spike basically having a life outside of like the main 6, and yes, we have seen that before, but again, just reinforcing that is at least pretty nice. But on the whole, this episode was just not very enjoyable for me, and I feel like a lot of it just doesn't feel right for me. So because of that, I do have it here at number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22, and we have an episode that's kind of similar to Dragon Dropped, but I do feel like it slightly edges it out. But here we have a Horseshoeing, one of the last episodes of the series. And to me, this episode is, again, not very fun to watch for a lot of it, where a lot of it is Trixie acting very entitled, assuming that she already has a job and that all the interviews are simply a formality, which obviously is not the case. And yes, a lot of it does feel like Starlight is slowly building up her anger until she eventually lashes out at Trixie towards the end. And that's not particularly fun to watch either. And there's some other weird stuff in this episode as well. Like there's the whole running joke of Starlight befriending Phyllis, like a literal plant. I mean, which sort of runs along with the joke that Starlight has kind of lost her mind to a degree. I mean, there's also the fact that Twilight and Spike literally announced to Starlight again that like she's going to be the head mayor of the Friendship School, which I believe they had already done in the season premiere, although it was done pretty quickly. But it was just weird to have that scene happen again and for them to act like they didn't already establish that. So that was a little weird. And it's not great for a lot of it. I feel like a lot of my dislike of this episode comes from Trixie's arrogance and entitlement for a lot of it, which just isn't fun to watch. But the main reason I hit this episode a little bit higher is a couple things. I feel like, for one, we have Starlight's outburst at the end. She has a pretty notable outburst at Trixie when she finally does snap. So there's that. And there's also the ending where Trixie does not actually become the head mayor, but is instead made the guidance counselor, which I guess you could say was a bit foreshown, but and a little bit forced, mind you. But I am glad that we do at least have that compromise towards the end. So at least there's that. But I feel like this episode is just pretty frustrating to watch for a lot of it. And while there are a couple moments that are ironically amusing, I feel like it's not enough to save this episode. So it is here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and we have another episode that, again, has a lot of weird stuff going on in it. But here we have Sweet and Smoky, and this was a very weird episode as well. And the first one on this list that seeks to tie up some loose ends, which obviously will be a recurring theme on this list for certain episodes. But obviously, this is the episode that gives Garble his redemption arc. And I've already talked in a previous video how jarring this redemption arc is, but just to recap, he basically acts like his normal self for the first half of it, with the minor foreshadowing of like Smolder talking about how Garble has a soft side and how like he's really sensitive deep down. And despite us never seeing that across the entire series, and actually in one episode, his whole plot being that he wants to be Dragon Lord so that he can invade Equestria, he all of a sudden gets his redemption arc in the second half of it, where his suddenly revealed that he is, as Smolder said, quite sensitive, and he has this weird beat poetry hobby of his, which comes completely out of left field and just doesn't feel right at all. And it's just so bizarre to see. And even more bizarre is the way in which this ties into the resolution, where we obviously see all of Garble's friends basically like harm the eggs by taking away all the lava. And obviously, with it being too cold, the eggs are not able to hatch. So Garble's plan to resolve this problem is to recite his beat poetry, which causes his friends to laugh because they think it's stupid and ridiculous, and that causes them to breathe fire, which in turn warms the eggs and saves the day. Really weird way to resolve the conflict, in my opinion, and I'm not entirely sure if it necessarily helps its case per se, because it's basically suggesting that Garble's friends were in the right for thinking that his poetry thing was like ridiculous, as it literally helps the conflict, and Garble knew that it would resolve the conflict. And it's only afterwards that Ember is able to talk some sense in him into saying, hey, this was the person who saved all the eggs and fixed your mistake. How dare you do laugh at him and do what you just did, which literally helped save the day and fix your mistake. Again, so weird, and I don't really enjoy the episode per se. I mean, it's not actively bad or frustrating or anything. It's just really bizarre, and I feel like it doesn't really come together in quite the way that certain other episodes with a similar story try to tackle here. But there are still a couple fine moments here and there. Like, we have some good moments with Spike and Smolder. We see Spike like really questioning over a lot of the episode whether Garble really is a sensitive dragon. And yes, while the reveal that it is quite jarring, like that is at least a cool storyline. And then we have Fluttershy being pretty assertive as usual, like again highlighting her character development here. So there is a couple minor things going for it, but this is just a really weird episode, and not in the good way. So because of that, I have this episode here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we have an episode that probably isn't as actively bad as the ones we just talked about, but isn't good either. But here we have Going to Seed, and to me, this episode is pretty boring, if you ask me. Now, there are some not great things about it, like Applejack, like spending the first half of the episode, like obviously being the voice of reason and trying to ensure that Apple Bloom isn't getting too distracted here. But then by the second half of the episode, just completely gives in, like seemingly out of nowhere, and just completely goes all in on searching for the great seedling. You also have Big Mac, who is getting increasingly overworked by the fact that people aren't working as hard, and in turn, contributing to the Great Seedling myth, which wasn't, I don't know, I felt it was a bit underwhelming that was ultimately the reveal, so that's not great. And while I don't have as many complaints with this episode, I just don't really care all that much for it, and it really fails to stick to my mind all that much. So, because of that, I do have it a bit lower, and it is here at number 20. Now, moving on to number 19, and we kind of have a similar deal to Going to Seed. And while this episode definitely has a bit more weird stuff going on, I do kind of enjoy it a bit more. But here we have Growing Up is Hard to Do. And this is your very typical episode about kids learning that there's more to being an adult than doing whatever you want. And it's really ham-fisted for a lot of it, where you have like that opening segment of each of the CMC asking like their older counterpart to take them to the festival, and not only do they say no, that they can't go, but they really double down on the fact that they're kids and that they can't go on their own. And even Applejack, just completely unprompted, is like, now don't you even think of trying to go on your own. You're too young. You don't have the responsibility, which again is completely forced for whatever reason. And it's just kind of funny, like how prompted and how forced a lot of this is, but it still doesn't help the episode too much. And later on the episode, I feel like, again, it kind of hammers home the conflict to an unnecessary degree, where obviously after they get to the festival, we see them meeting these kids who obviously help them escort them to the festival because they don't have their like adults around. But then once they get to the festival, like they just kind of expect the CMC to be their guardians, even though they never actually agreed to do so. They just said that they would help them escort them to the festival. And from that point on, like when the CMC do whatever they want and don't really like watch them afterwards, like again, it's just a way to completely berate the CMC for again thinking that grown-ups can just do whatever they want, like not have any responsibilities, which again is pretty forced. And obviously at the end, they learn their lesson, they turn back into kids. Again, it's your very standard story, and it's almost kind of laughable how much they hammer home that be at almost any cost, even if it doesn't make the most sense in the world. But the main reason I have this episode a bit higher is, for one, I don't feel like it's as frustrating as something like 246 Great, for example. But also, there are a couple moments, namely the song. I actually do like the song Being Big Is All It Takes. I like seeing a lot of the visuals in that song, which, and it's also a catchy tune, which definitely makes the episode stand out to a positive degree. And plus, I do kind of like the designs of the CMC when they're grown ups. So there are some minor positives here, and I don't feel like it's as frustrating to watch as certain other episodes that again hammer home the story that they're trying to tell. But it's still not a great episode and not one that I can reward too much. So because of that, it is here number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we have an episode that's kind of the opposite of Growing Up is Hard to Do, whereas that episode is pretty standard and pretty laughably so. I feel like this episode is a bit more polarizing, where it has some pretty notable moments, but also some pretty frustrating moments that do cause it to land here. But here we have The Last Crusade, and this episode has some pretty major negatives here. I feel like the main one being the way that Scootaloo's parents are portrayed here, where I do kind of understand the conflict that they're presenting here, where obviously Scootaloo's parents have these jobs that require them to live far away, and they are at least somewhat concerned about Scootaloo with the increased threat in Equestria, to where they feel the need to have the family all be together and to move Scootaloo away from Ponyville and away from her friends. But obviously that's just it. The parents are just so oblivious to all the ways in which they're treating Scootaloo unfairly here. I mean, for one, the entire premise said they have to be together now, and that now is particularly a time of crisis. Like, they cite Somber's recent invasion of Equestria here, which I guess is something. And, you know, like with what we know, at least, we know that the threat to Equestria is becoming great, which will culminate later on in season 9. But by this point in the series, there have been so many threats to Equestria between Nightmare Moon, between Tyrek, between the changelings. I mean, there have been so many instances at this point where Equestria's been under attack, so many points where Scootaloo's parents could have realized that these times are unprecedented and that we should probably be a bit more involved in our kids' lives. The fact that they chose now, after everything we've been through, that this is the time for us to all be together is pretty arbitrary, which isn't great on its own. But again, more so the fact that they just don't seem to understand the way in which this is completely unfair, how it's completely unreasonable to expect Scootaloo to just uproot her entire life and move away. And I do love the line Scootaloo says, how they're changing her whole life without even asking how she feels. But it also makes the parents here feel a bit frustrating. And again, while I do understand where they're coming from, it doesn't lead to that great of an experience here. And that's not great. And I feel like they are a big reason why this episode is hard to a degree. But with that said, I do feel like there are still some positives here and there that do keep this episode from being lower on the list. Like, I do like us being introduced to Scootaloo's aunts and having a bit more insight into Scootaloo's living situation when her parents aren't around. So at least there's that. And I do love the ending where the CMC are able to convince the parents that Scootaloo should stay by showing how the CMC have their own job here in Ponyville that is just as important as her parents, and that's why she should stay. And I do love the whole CMC Appreciation Day. Again, it's a nice little culmination of everything that's done in the series. And yes, while it is kind of a retread of what we saw at the end of Crusaders of the Lost Mark, it is still a nice moment nonetheless. So there are still moments on this episode that I do like a decent amount, that do elevate it to a degree, but I do ultimately feel like the parents drag down the episode to such a degree by their just complete disregard and how slow they are to pick up on how they're hurting their daughter for a lot of this, that I can't have this episode any higher than 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we have an episode that kind of has similar issues to episodes that we've already talked about, and that's a big reason why it's as low as it is. However, I do feel like it executes them a bit better than those other ones, but here we have Daring Doubt here, and I've already talked about this episode before in the context of Awizodal and Caballeron's redemption arcs here, which I don't feel like are great, as Caballeron's is pretty generic for the most part. Fluttershy pretty much just teaches him that there's another way, and he just kind of learns it by the end of it. And then Awizodal's, which kind of comes out of left field in that we suddenly learn out of nowhere that Awizodal is this guardian of like his culture, and how Daring Do is actually this exploiter of that who steals all these artifacts and ruins everything, and that he has been presented as this monster when in reality he's not so bad after all. And all of this feels like it comes largely out of nowhere, particularly in the context of the rest of the series, where we don't really get that much foreshadowing to it before this episode. And that's why in my redemption arc video, I was pretty low on Awizodal's redemption arc, and that there really wasn't much setup there. But I feel like within this episode, at least, it isn't as big of a problem. And I do at least appreciate some of the issues that they were trying to bring up here. And obviously, they were kind of alluded to in Daring Done, but are more fully explored here. This idea that Daring Do may not be this unambiguously good hero whose deeds are without like any issue. I mean, there clearly are issues here, and I feel like the fact that this episode kind of doubles down on that is still something I appreciate to a degree, and something that I do find at least moderately interesting. But I still feel like it's held down enough by those issues, and plus, I don't feel like it really resolves how Daring Do or Caballeron move on from these revelations. It does seem like Daring Do's like career as an author is kind of in doubt, to where she would radically need to change course and really need to change her image in order to not seem so bad anymore. But the episode just kind of, I guess, dismisses that to a degree, instead of focuses on Awizodal starting to tell his story a bit more. So it's not as if this episode is great by any means, but I do at least appreciate some of the ideas that it brings forth. And while it doesn't fit super well in the context of the rest of the series, the episode does an okay enough job presenting them as they are, which is why I do have this episode a bit higher. but I still have to leave it here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have an episode that is just kind of all right and not really one that I care all that much about. But here we have Student Council, and the funny thing about this episode is it's sort of funny comparing it to Marks for Effort, where we see Starlight going from having no one around at a school of friendship to literally having this band around her hoof that allows her to just like go to her office on demand because she's that much in demand at this point, which is pretty interesting to see how that's evolved over time. Now, this is a Starlight and Trixie episode, and with that, you'll have Trixie kind of expecting a bit too much out of Starlight and her getting a bit annoyed that Starlight isn't spending more time with her. But honestly, compared to other Starlight Trixie episodes in which Trixie is sort of being demanding on Starlight, this one isn't nearly as bad and is actually kind of reasonable. And it's interesting seeing these different ponies interact, particularly Starlight, Trixie, Maud, Mudbriar, and Sunburst here. But on the whole, I actually found this episode a bit underwhelming by the end of it, as I didn't really see much of the point to it. Where obviously the whole thing revolves around Silverstream going missing and them wondering where she is, and they're looking for her, and they feel like she's being attacked by these cockatrices, when in fact Silverstream had just gone off on her own to study the cockatrices. And yeah, I'll admit that there was a bit of lead up to that, but on the whole, I just didn't find this episode to have too much of a payoff for me, where I didn't feel like it was that great at the end of the day. But it's not a bad episode per se, it's just one that's not really memorable, and because of that, it is here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have another episode kind of in this tier, although there is a slightly more going on, but here we have Uprooted. And to me, Uprooted is largely a worse version of Castle Sweet Castle. It has a pretty similar premise with the Creature 6 having to deal with the fact that the Tree of Harmony has been destroyed, and they're trying to make the most out of it, with each of them having a different approach. And a lot of it focuses around the shenanigans of them trying to do different things, like Silverstream trying to paint the floor, while Gallus is trying to sell merchandise, and Ocellus is trying to set up her garden. And all the while, Yona is just kind of in the middle, trying to get them to like bring their heads together and really try to see what the Tree of Harmony truly represents. Like it leads to some bickering. Like there's a big fight towards the end, which it just is what it is. And then we have the song of them trying to rebuild it, and I've always found the song like kind of middle of the road. I mean, it's not a bad song, but it's also not one that's overly memorable or catchy. But it is a somewhat nice moment at the end to see them like finally come together and make it into a treehouse that isn't really utilized that much, but I mean, it's something, I guess. So on the whole, this episode, similar to Student Council, it's just kind of fine. And while I did get slightly more enjoyment out of it, I feel like there are plenty of other episodes, not just in this season, but across previous seasons, that are better than it and leave more of an impression on me. So because of that, I have it here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have a slightly better episode in my personal opinion, even though this episode does seem to be setting up future storylines more than anything else. But here we have the Summer Sun Setback, and this is a mostly good episode. I actually compared it at points to the Mean Six, as a lot of it did feel like a lot of comedy of errors and things going wrong. Although it's obviously a more enjoyable watch than the Mean Six, in my opinion, where you obviously have a couple things going on. You have the like evil three at this point of Tyrek, Cozy Glow, and Chrysalis. They're trying to team up in order to like ruin the Summer Sun celebration. You have the Main Six trying to walk around Twilight, trying to prevent her from panicking, and them assuming that she would panic at the first opportunity, which is kind of warranted given a certain episode we talked about Zoom that happened not too long before this, only for the whole twist, I say, is that Twilight was actually calm the whole time and that she's learned her lesson. And I guess you can talk a bit about that other episode, A Trivial Pursuit, in which she obviously acts very panicked the whole time over something so minute. Though I guess you could say she learned something, which is kind of funny, but also showing her character growth to a degree there. And on the whole, this is just kind of a fine episode again, where despite it having some interesting stuff, I can't say that it doesn't do much beyond progressing the story towards future storylines, of course, mainly the last two-parter they'll be talking about pretty soon. But aside from that, this is just kind of a fine episode. and it's here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and I actually had a debate between these next two episodes as I feel like they kind of hover around the same level, and I do like both of them, albeit for different reasons. But at number 13, I did decide to go with She Talks to Angel, and for me, the main enjoyment of this episode comes from seeing Angel running around in Fluttershy's body, just hearing his, I guess, voice per se, and hearing his expressions and stuff like expressed through Fluttershy. And there's plenty of comedy with Fluttershy acting like a complete child, but also just hearing Angel actually having a voice for once is pretty amusing. But on the whole, I did find this episode to be a bit, like general in that a lot of it is about, oh, well, you haven't taken a walk in my shoes, and it's just your typical buy swap episode. Both the characters just kind of learn by the end that, hey, maybe the other person doesn't have it so easy as I thought, which, is fine, I guess, but compared to certain other episodes we'll be talking about soon, I felt like it was a bit generic, but really it's just the comedy of seeing Angel, like, running around in Fluttershy's body, finally hearing him talk, I guess, to a degree, and then, of course, Fluttershy just being completely lost in Angel's body as well is enough to have it at least this high on the list. But with that said, I can't have it any higher than number 13 here. Now moving on to number 12, and I feel like this episode definitely has more flaws than She Talks to Angel, but I do get a bit more enjoyment out of it. But here we have The Point of No Return. And obviously, this episode is a spiritual successor to Amending Fences, which, if you see my season 5 video, you'll probably know that that episode's kind of high on that list, but that's for another day. But anywho, this episode does take a lot of notes from Amending Fences in that it tries to connect the story back to season 1, with Twilight just happening to brush aside a book about perfection that she just forgets about until now, and then she spends the whole episode trying to make things right. She feels like she caused like Dusty Pages to get fired or to lose her will to live over like not returning this book, and she spends the episode trying to find her. And I will admit that this episode is a bit flimsier on its premise than Amending Fences, where it definitely tries to really make a meal out of the fact that Twilight just forgot to turn in a book, which, again, you could debate like to the extent to which she freaks out over this, but considering that the book is literally about perfection and how it's impossible, like, I feel like it makes it so that this entire episode could have been avoided if she had just looked at the cover or maybe even read it. And I don't mind the fact that she didn't actually read it. I mean, it's kind of a joke that Twilight doesn't even read the books because she checks out so many. But still, the fact that she could have at least looked at the cover and made her think that maybe she was overreacting is a bit silly in my opinion. And I guess on a similar note, I mean, learning that Dusty Pages was actually motivated to quit her job because of Twilight's mistake here, and her learning that she no longer had to like rely so much on perfection, again, did feel a little flimsy as well. But honestly, I don't mind it as much as certain other people. I actually find it interesting, like Twilight going on this journey to try to find Dusty Pages, only to find her in this retirement center where she is enjoying life and has really grown as a character. I did find that element at least interesting, even if a lot of the premise itself isn't the most well balanced in my personal opinion. Also, it is pretty nice to see Moondancer in this episode, not gonna lie. But on the whole, I did find this episode pretty enjoyable for the most part, and it was interesting seeing them trying to follow up Amending Fences the best that they could. But again, I feel like the premise itself does have some issues that does make it a bit jarring for me, and because of that, I do have it here at number 12. Now I'm moving on to number 11, and honestly, I didn't know exactly where to put this episode, which is kind of why I just left it here. But here we have the Big Mac question, and I think there are a couple things going for this episode. I mean, for one, I like the presentation of it, where it's sort of similar to Saddle Row Review, where it is sort of like this confessional based thing where we keep cutting back to characters describing the events after they've happened, sort of like this flashback thing. And I do find that pretty effective, sort of to spice things up to a degree. And considering the story, the fact that it is, again, sort of built around misunderstandings, I do at least appreciate the effort to make it a bit more interesting. Like, and yes, while there are some like things I don't like you have, your usual Discord antics and what have you, I don't think it's really enough to drag down the episode too much. So at least there's that. Also, obviously we had to talk about Lyra and Bon Bon like getting engaged in this episode, which is then followed up upon in the last problem. So at least there's that. I mean, I just had to bring that up. And on the whole, this is again a pretty good episode. Definitely much better than the breakup breakdown, which I already tore to shreds in my season 8 video, so you can check that out. But again, I feel like the episodes we'll be talking about soon have a bit more going for them, have a bit more gravitas. But with that said, I feel like the merits in this episode are enough to put it here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and obviously we're now inside the top 10. And I also feel like this is where the list starts to get interesting, as we're going to be talking about some pretty notable episodes here. Some good, some of them are a bit controversial, but I'll get into my reasoning soon enough. But on number 10, I actually have a two-parter here. In fact, it's the final two-parter of the series. And here we have the ending of the end. And I actually had a debate between the ending of the end and the beginning of the end in terms of which one I enjoy better. I did decide to give the beginning of the end the edge, largely because I feel like there are fewer issues with that episode compared to this, where obviously there are plenty of issues with the ending and the end. I mean, first up, the Grogar stuff, pretty bad. I mean, people have already talked about it before. It's not only a really bad twist in that it deprives us of this very interesting villain that could have tied everything together, but it also retroactively kind of ruins Discord's redemption arc by making him go back to sort of his old ways here, and that he literally does something very similar to what he did in Twilight's Kingdom. But obviously the main difference in Twilight's Kingdom is that at least there we obviously were at a point where Discord had not learned his lesson, but you could also at least see his rationale for why he chose to work with Tyrek, where he had already bought into the idea of friendship, and he saw this act of like working with Tyrek not so much as a sign of betrayal or him going back to his old ways, but him trying to be friends with Tyrek, someone who had a history with, and someone he was trying to be on his good side and try to prove to him that he hadn't gone soft or whatever, only to be betrayed at the end. But obviously here, I mean, not only should Discord know better, as he had already gone through that experience before, but his reasoning for doing so is also pretty bad, where he wanted to give Twilight one more test to prove that she's ready to rule Equestria, and that she needs to build her confidence, which is just ridiculous considering how many times Twilight has already saved Equestria before, and how much she has really shown her growth over the course of the series. And for Discord to really endanger Equestria, like to accomplish something that really was already accomplished is just really bad. And the fact that Discord isn't really punished more for this is pretty ridiculous at the end of the day. But even outside of that, I mean, we see Twilight's reaction to all this, where it does seem like she starts to lose her confidence here. And admittedly, I'm not as hard on this as I was the first time I talked about this episode, but I still find it hard to really see Twilight's perspective on all this, where sure, like, things seem impossible, and sure, things have been overwhelming in the past, but literally we're at the point now where Twilight's already done this a number of times, and the show went out of its way to at least establish that Twilight's been like sizing up herself up to the moment and really building her confidence, which, to be fair, could be used to explain why she's a bit more nervous now than she was before, despite the odds being against her. Still, I did find a lot of that kind of ringing hollow in light of everything we've already faced before, so there's that. And then, of course, we have the ending where the Evil Three are defeated, and we see them get turned into stone because they have rejected friendship and redemption, which just does seem like a really weird way to end things. I mean, again, I feel like a lot of it ties back to the sentiment that was happening around season 8 in Cozy Glow, where it really feels like the writers are becoming self-conscious of this reputation the show has for redeeming villains, and how it doesn't seem to realize that true evil can exist. And I feel like by doing that, they kind of course corrected in the complete opposite direction by making it so that characters that probably should have been redeemed, or at least characters that should have gotten a backstory, just don't. And through that, like, they really want to set up that, see, we do have evil villains. See, we don't just redeem them. Sometimes they're just evil and we need to defeat them, which is just a weird way to end things on. Where I guess it would have worked better if maybe they didn't redeem them at first, like, but then like once they come back in later seasons, like maybe they escape, then maybe you could have them redeemed around then, like maybe you learn more about them and stuff. But for literally the last two part of the entire series to end with these characters not being redeemed and in fact being turned into stone, it's just really weird in my personal opinion. But taking all that out, I did find this two part still to be pretty entertaining. I mean, for one, like it does have that, like stakes that comes with most two parters. Like you really do get the sense that all these threats are coming together at once to really threaten Equestria. And yes, while I do criticize Twilight for like caving in to all that and losing her confidence, like it really does feel like the overall threats at present are like reaching their apex and that it's not being overshadowed by something that came before. Like in some of the threats involved are interesting. Like you have Chrysalis going around and sowing distrust between the different races, which is pretty interesting considering what happens in G5. But again, that's for another video. Like so, like I do like the aspect to it that they are taking a more ground level approach to sowing all this distrust between the different races to where they can't rely on each other anymore. So there's that. And also the Wendigos, which I did feel like was a bit extra considering everything else we've already like encountered so far. But again, it does kind of make sense in a way, but like it is what it is. And then, we obviously had the fight scenes, which are pretty good for the most part. Like again, being able to build up the good stakes, like in part one, we see everyone being defeated and culminating with Twilight like escaping to the Crystal Empire. And then in part two, we have the main six utilizing each other's strengths in order to outwit the evil three, and then all the creatures from across Equestria coming together and saving the day. I mean, like there is some merit to this episode, and it does do its job of feeling like a two-parter. But with all that said, there are just so many issues I have with it, like in terms of its premise and its execution, that I can't have it too much higher than here. But considering the factors that I have discussed, I figured 10 is a good spot for it. Now moving on to number 9, and this is another episode that I kind of went back and forth on, but I did decide to leave it at least this high. But here we have Sparkle 7, the 200th episode of the series, and again, this is a mostly lighthearted episode. I do like how like each of the voice actors for the main six were involved in writing the story for this, which probably does contribute to some of the weird stuff going on in there. Like there's a lot of just random stuff thrown in there, which considering the later tone of this episode is probably more excusable than anything else. But I also find it kind of strange how they're like using this in order to test their system for like monitoring the castle and stuff. Like, I figured they would probably want to take it a bit more seriously, but it is what it is. Like, and again, there's plenty of good jokes in there. Like, there's plenty of interesting stuff going on, like with Spike feeling a bit overshadowed and I guess conspiring with Luna in order to try to steal the crown and win the game. And I do love Luna's face, like, reveal at the end when she's like grooming one of the birds, and it turns out that she was sort of like screwing everything up. So at least there's that. So on the whole, I did find this a pretty enjoyable episode. Not one that I have too much to say on it, but again, there's plenty of callbacks to it, plenty of good jokes, and you can tell that similar to Slice of Life, they were at least trying to celebrate the series in a way, though not as overtly fan servicey as something like Slice of Life. So because of that, I do have it at least this high, though I feel like the other episodes are a bit better, and it's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we actually have a pretty similar episode to Sparkle 7, and definitely one that's a lot more controversial than it. And I actually know people that really hate this episode, but I actually kind of like it. But here we have a Trivial Pursuit, and I know I'm going to sound like a crazy person for having it this high on the list. I know people like Star Giant, for example, have called it one of the worst episodes in the entire series. And you would think, considering how a lot of this episode involves Twilight not treating Pinky the best, you would think I would have this episode much lower on the list. But really, after thinking about some more, I do find this episode to be really funny in a lot of ways, as a lot of it does seem to be pretty lighthearted for the most part. And yes, while it's not ideal that Twilight is losing her mind over something as trivial as a game, it is interesting to see it from a comedic perspective, but also like similar to what I said about Summer Sun Setback, her like finally learning her lesson and from there having some continuity moving forward with her like learning to take things more relaxed. So at least there's that. But I did find a lot of the questions asked during the game to be pretty interesting. A lot of them are pretty interesting callbacks to different moments throughout the series, and not something in an overt way as something you would see from Slice of Life or Sparkle 7, but you still get plenty of interesting questions like who is the name of the character from A Heartwarming Tale, or the number of holes in Daring Two's hat, or Ghastly Gorge, or the Zap Apples. Like there's all these like random references thrown in from previous episodes. Yeah, again, it's pretty fun for the most part. You also have Twilight's whole science behind the different combinations and the teams, and her getting the one worst case scenario in getting Pinky, someone who has never played before. And something else I'll mention about this, and really this applies to all of season 9, but I do like the faces and the way this episode is animated. So, something you might notice about season 9 is you can clearly tell that all these episodes were made after the movie. And obviously, the movie sort of redesigned the characters in a lot of ways to, I guess, be a bit more chubby in a way and like a bit more cartoonish as well, like lean to more expressive faces, but again, still retaining this more chubby appearance that contrasted from something like from season 1, for example. And you can tell that these episodes in season 9 are heavily influenced by that animation style, and they might have used the same assets as well, which leads to some of the most bizarre facial reactions in the entire series. And these are littered all throughout season 9. And I try my best in this video to pick screenshots from these episodes that like use these faces to sort of illustrate my point here. They're not only really funny, but they're also incredibly mesmerizing to where I will literally pause an episode whenever I see one of these faces just to stare at it because it's just so captivating to me. And I know that sounds really weird for me to say, but it's just an effect of season 9 in general. But to bring it back to this episode just uses a lot of these. Like literally every other second, like a character is just making this weird face, and it's just so interesting to me. So really, despite this episode seeming to have a lot of knocks against it, to where you probably think I would have it lower, and I'm sure some people even now, after me explain this, will probably think that this episode should be lower, but I just can't justify it. I just like this episode despite all the things going against it. And despite me not caring too much about more comedic episodes and more light-hearted episodes, I come away liking this episode quite a lot. And it's so weird for me to say that, but it just is what it is. So while I can't put it any higher than here, I do like this episode a lot to where I at least have it here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I did debate whether this episode is too high, although I did decide to land it at least here. But here we have the beginning of the end, the final two-parter left to talk about in these series of videos. And again, I did think about it, and I still think it is better than the ending of the end. I had it higher than the ending of the end, even at the time of my original two-parter ranking, and I still feel like that's the case. But even then, I don't feel like this is necessarily the best one. In a lot of ways, it really does feel like a lesser version of Twilight Kingdom, where you have Twilight worrying so much about being the ruler and her having this really massive conflict on her hands. And through that, we see her along with the rest of the main six trying to solve the problem with Sombra taking over Equestria seemingly with little issue. And through that, we do get some pretty interesting stuff, particularly in part 2 when Sombra is able to basically mind control everyone in Ponyville. Now, I am a little mixed on this aspect of the episode, as on one hand, it is interesting seeing them going back to Ponyville and actually worrying about like their fellow loved ones and them being in direct danger due to Sombra's spell, and just seeing the moment of seeing people like a Starlight or Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo, all of them being under the mind control, all while the main six are pretty helpless in stopping them, is pretty interesting. And then later on, when we see all these towns ponies trying to stop them, we see them having this whole dilemma over we need to stop them but not actually hurt them. So that was at least somewhat interesting. But on the other hand, it does suffer from the fact that this is season 9, and at this point we have had so many instances of Equestria being in danger and all these loved ones also being in danger as well. We literally saw in To Where and Back Again that the changelings were able to essentially take over all of Equestria and literally capture all these ponies and have them stuck in this really miserable looking cocoon concoction while all the changelings are basically feeding off their love and basically shapeshifting to pretend to be them. So we literally had stuff like this play out in the past, not to mention Twilight's Kingdom, where Tierk literally invades Ponyville and they have this massive battle not too far from there. So it's not as if this is unprecedented, and the fact that we're only now seeing this play out of the main six being so worried about the livelihoods of their loved ones is pretty ridiculous as well. So there's that to consider, and not to mention the fact that this all leads into the Last Crusade, where the parents are worried about this specific conflict despite everything else that has happened beforehand. So I did have to contend with that. And then the other aspect to the episode is Discord, where this is obviously the start of this whole Grogar scheme. And while we don't know at this particular time that he is supposed to be Grogar, it's still interesting watching in hindsight how this all plays into his behavior in this episode, particularly with his big quote unquote sacrifice towards the end, where he literally is seemingly on death's door and he's just giving this motivational speech to each of the main six. Again, with the knowledge that he was the one responsible for all this, is pretty interesting, and it does lead to him feeling like he is testing each of them and really using this as a way of building them up. And then we get to the ending where Sombra is defeated and Grogar is using this as an example as to why each of the bad guys should be working together, which again was pretty interesting and did kickstart the rest of the season 9 storyline here, which obviously I'll be talking a bit more about later on with one other episode. So it's not as if this is a bad two-parter. And again, when comparing it to the ending of the end, I do feel like this episode stands better on its own and definitely has less problems with it. Though even then, it's still not free of issues, and it's not the most interesting two-part in the world, so I can't have it too much higher on this list, though I still feel like it is better than the ending of the end, which is why it is here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and these are the clear top 6 for me. These are the 6 episodes I enjoy the most from season 9. But number 6, we do have the episode that's probably the lightest of the bunch, and here we have Between Dark and Dawn. And this is just a pretty entertaining episode for the most part. It's pretty comedic with a lot of gags with Luna and Celestia trying to save the day now that they have more time on their hands, only for them to be basically pushed aside to go on a vacation. We then get to the Lot of Little Things song, which is definitely one of the more catchy songs from the later seasons. And I compared it before to Friendship Bound from season 8. And I do feel like this is the better version of that song, where it's pretty upbeat, a lot of interesting visuals with them going to different places along the way. And in general, we also see a lot of people just randomly admiring the princesses, not really expecting to see them out and about. And they always get pretty excited whenever they show up, which I found to be a pretty nice touch. We also get to the side plot, which is definitely not the greatest in the world, with Twilight trying to take over, and she gets pretty up in arms over the whole like delegation, where she really struggles to put together this banquet and even shoos aside the committee and tries to do it all herself, but then learns throughout the course of the episode that she needs to have people to delegate. The actual side plot itself isn't the most interesting in the world. I mean, it's a pretty standard lesson that you would think Twilight would have learned by now, but I always loved her face when she finally figures it out and she sees everyone just doing their jobs, and then she gets this most maniacal face when she says, "Now this is delegating." I don't know, I always love that moment. Though obviously we get to the end when she tries to switch out the sun and the moon using the time turner and then just completely failing at that. And she gets some more pretty funny faces as she's trying and failing to operate that. So at least there's some comedy there. But returning to the main plot, I mean, a big focus here is, again, focusing on Celestia and Luna's relationship, where they obviously get on each other's nerves as the episode goes on, to the point where they decide to go off on their own. And I do love the difference between the two, with Celestia being more of a thrill seeker, while Luna is someone who wants something a bit more relaxed. And it obviously culminates with them deciding to go their separate ways, with them deciding to go off on their own, only for them to not be super happy when they do that, with Luna getting a sunburn and Celestia getting lost in the woods, which was pretty interesting. And obviously they do make up by the end of it, only to return to the castle because Twilight is screwing up the sun and the moon. So, on the whole, I did find this episode to be pretty entertaining consistently. And again, there's a lot of pretty good moments in here, a lot of good jokes in there, a lot of interesting music in there, a lot of great visuals as well. And it's a pretty good story. Now, I wouldn't say it's the most interesting story in the world, which is part of the reason why it's this low on the list, but I still enjoy it a lot. And because of that, it is here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5. And honestly, I wasn't expecting this episode to be this high, as despite it being a good episode, it's not one that I normally think about. But after thinking about it some more, I did decide it deserved to be here. But here we have Common Ground, aka the return of Quibble Pants, voiced by Patton Oswalt. And I really like this episode the more that I think about it. Obviously, a major focus of the episode is Pants trying to do right by Wind Spirit, who is essentially his stepdaughter now, as she doesn't really see him as her true father, and she doesn't really click with him super well. And in general, I find this dynamic to be pretty interesting, and it becomes even more interesting when you factor in the real life context behind it, where if you don't know, Wind Spirit is voiced by Patton Oswalt's real life daughter Alice, whose mother sadly passed away in 2016, while Clear Sky is voiced by Meredith Salinger, who Patton Oswalt ended up getting married to after his first wife passed away. So through that, we're basically seeing not only Patton Oswalt in this episode, but literally his entire family getting to get this experience together and having this story that relates somewhat to their real lives, which is pretty interesting on its own right. But talking about the rest of the episode, it's very interesting seeing Pans trying so hard to make it seem like he's into sports and that he's actually pretty good at sports, when in reality he has no idea what he's doing. And obviously he goes to Rainbow Dash trying to get her help, only to come up short when he tries to play buckball in the middle of the episode, only to end up scoring for his own team, which is pretty humorous. But along the way, we see Wind Spirit not being too impressed by all these efforts, while Clear Sky isn't too happy about the whole situation either, where she feels like Pants is trying so hard to be something that he's not. And at the same time, being really understanding of where he's coming from and seeing just where he's trying to do all this. And I always love the scene later in the episode when Wind Spirit is saying how like Pants is nothing like dad, but Clear Sky tries to make it clear that like her dad loves her and that Pants is trying really hard to care for her and like to be a part of her life. And I always find that moment to be pretty nice as well. And then we get a pretty nice resolution where they do build a better relationship, and Pants does admit that he was trying too hard to show that he was into sports. Rainbow Dash realizes that she needed to change course, and in doing so, they sort of realize that while Pants himself doesn't know much about buckball, that he can use Wind Spirit to learn more about it and like really like make Wind Spirit feel like that like he cares about what he cares about and that he's willing to learn, which is pretty nice on its own. So really taking everything into account, this is a pretty solid episode, pretty solid story. I do like the characters quite a lot. And again, factor in the real life stuff. It makes it all pretty interesting in my eyes. But I still feel like the top 4 episodes top it for me, which is why I do have to leave it here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we kind of have a similar episode in that it also has a celebrity guest star returning once again. But I did decide that this episode was slightly more interesting than Common Ground. But here we have The Last Laugh. And I do love this episode a lot. It's really the first episode in really a while that really focused on Pinky trying to find her purpose in her life, with her coming to terms with the fact that everyone else is off doing big and bold things while she is largely doing the same stuff that she's been doing before. I mean, and on one hand, one could see that as being pretty self-actualized, but on the other hand, I mean, considering the fact that we had seen like in previous seasons, like Rainbow Dash becoming a Wonder Bowl, with Rarity opening more boutiques, with Fluttershy opening a sanctuary, you know, like with Twilight becoming the ruler of Equestria, and Applejack having her farm, like she does question like whether she is on the right track in her life, and she obviously goes off to like Cheese and trying to find him at his factory, only to find out that Cheese has sort of lost his sparkle as well through him running his factory and really mass producing a lot of gags that are really technically based and ones that are engineered to get down laughter to a science, but in doing so, he sort of loses a lot of the humanity involved. Along the way, we also meet Sand Smirk, who is a very interesting character, where on one hand, he is obviously very dry, deadpan, like he doesn't seem to be much of a comedian on his own, But on the other hand, like you can definitely tell that he cares a lot for his boss. Like he isn't trying to impose like this more corporate style on a cheese sandwich. Like he really does respect and look up to cheese in order to engineer all this stuff and get inspiration. But you can still see how he has a different approach to things, how he views laughter as a more scientific approach. And what I do find interesting as well is that he doesn't really change that much by the end of it. I mean, he still cares for his boss and he still views laughter through his own lens, but we come to terms with the fact that like they are suited for different roles, and Cheese hands over the factory to Sand Smirk so that he can handle the more mass produced stuff, while Cheese himself is more of the adventurer, more someone that gets out there and is in the field and actually making the laughter happen. So I find those two philosophies coming together to be very interesting, and I'm really glad that Sand Smirk wasn't treated as this antagonist or this force that needed to grow to really accept the other ways. They really do have their own ways of viewing like laughter and this whole comedy business. It's just them trying to figure out how to best go about that and them being sorted into the roles that suits them best, which I do find pretty nice. Pinky, of course, is her usual self with her really caring for her cheese sandwich, and I always love seeing their relationship playing out, which obviously leads into them getting married by the end of the series, which obviously I'll be talking about more shortly. And this is a pretty fun episode. We obviously get a pretty fun musical number towards the end as well. Plenty of interesting moments of Pinky trying to get Cheese to start laughing again and to start smiling again, only to fail. And obviously, them coming to terms with it by the end of it, with them finally figuring out that Cheese needs to be himself, is also a pretty nice story. And I do love the gag as well with Pinky recounting all of this. And literally at the end, after she resolves everything, it cuts back to her in the throne room, and she's like, "Oh, and then I went back to you guys, and I started telling the story," and she starts to tell the story again, which I did find to be a pretty funny gag. So on the whole, I do find this to be a very solid episode. It has very interesting ideas going for it as a pretty solid story. I do like the way it executes the story, and I do love a lot of the comedy in it as well. It is a very enjoyable episode from beginning to end. But with that said, I do feel like the top three episodes are better for me. It's more of a personal preference at this point, which is why I did decide to leave it here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and for me, this episode was very close with The Last Laugh. I actually had a debate between putting The Last Laugh above it, and in my episode ranking that I'll do later on, there is a chance I could reevaluate this. But for now, I did decide to have The Last Problem here at number 3, the series finale, and I do feel like this is a pretty good episode. Granted, I think it gets a bit overrated as people say that it's one of the best episodes in the entire series and how it's very emotional, and it definitely has plenty of emotional moments, though I still have some minor nitpicks with it. I don't love how the whole coronation is treated as a joke, where we see Twilight basically causing all the other plans for her own coronation to go awry because she decided to have a meltdown basically in front of her friends right before leaving for the train station, which obviously leads to everything going wrong with the dress not being right, with all the fireworks going on off at the wrong time, with Twilight tripping and hanging over the balcony at one point. I mean, it's not really the way I would have approached it, and considering what we know now about G5 and what ends up happening during Twilight's rule, it's not really the best omen that she has such a disastrous coronation. And considering how much gravitas like her princess ascension was in season 3, for her to have her actual coronation as the full-on ruler to be treated as this joke was just really weird in my opinion, and seems like more like this weird subversion than anything else, and also to make this feel like a more lighthearted episode than what we just got in the two-part beforehand. But it's not as if it's the worst thing in the world, and I do like how afterwards we do see them laughing about the whole thing, how just because she's the princess doesn't mean they still can't be friends, which does lead me to the message of the episode, showing how even as like friends like move on to bigger and better plans, that they can still be involved in each other's lives. I mean, it is a pretty necessary message and definitely one that was always going to be present for the last episode of the series, but I do like how they kind of executed here, with particularly earlier on in the episode before the coronation, where Twilight is going around seeing all the preparations, and each of the main five like trying to act like normally as possible, like only for her to make be more upset by this, to make it seem like they don't care, only to lead into the blow up immediately afterwards, which again, may have been a bit of an overreaction, but obviously that causes the main five to admit that they were sad and they wanted things to be normal, and they were trying really hard to just distract themselves with all the preparations, which did lead to the cry pile. And I kind of joked about this before about how this basically came off as her friends like sucking up to her by making it a crying contest to see like who would be the most sad that Twilight is leaving. But it's still a pretty heartfelt moment for the most part, and obviously leads directly into them racing to the coronation and everything going wrong. There's also Starlight's whole shtick with her trying to give her the scrapbook, which is an entire series of clip shows that I don't really talk about much in the rankings, but it's just fine. Again, obviously her giving her the scrapbook by the end of it is a nice moment. And then we have all the stuff in the future as well, where we see Equestria being this utopia, this multicultural melting pot, which, again, considering what we know now about G5, again, maybe a bit harsher in hindsight, knowing that it all comes crumbling down, that we don't really know what happens to these creatures moving forward. But again, if we're taking Friendship is Magic on its own, it's a pretty nice resolution. We obviously see each of the main six older now, with Twilight having grown up to look more like Celestia. We have Spike now being pretty grown up, but even so, like not like an enormous dragon, like, pretty reasonably sized for an adult dragon. And I do love the jokes about how Luster Dawn doesn't recognize his role as the royal advisor, which was pretty funny, and him just overreacting to Luster John literally regurgitating all the points Twilight made in the pilot about how friendship doesn't matter and how like she would rather be studying than having all these crazy ponies trying to be friends with her. I mean, that's a pretty nice moment. We have each of the main five coming in, again, revealing their older selves, like really showing like how much older they've gotten. And just a reminder that Twilight's probably going to outlive them, which again was probably more upsetting than anything else. But I figure at this point, plenty people recognize that by Twilight becoming an alicorn, that she would more or less outlive the rest of the main six. But even so, the designs themselves are pretty nice, with Rarity dyeing her mane purple, but again, some of her gray stuff shining through. We have Pinky really growing out her hair. I mean, we have Rainbow and Applejack, who are essentially implied to be in a same sex relationship. Again, and they don't really clarify at any point that they are, but basically, based on what they're saying and the way that they're so close to each other, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that they did end up falling in love, which was a pretty interesting way to cap that off. And then we have the ending where they have The Magic of Friendship Grows, which is a pretty solid song and a pretty nice song to end the series. We obviously have that moment during the final chorus where we see all the ponies that they met over the course of the series. And in fact, we even get a sunset spotting during Twilight's, which is pretty interesting. And then, of course, this leads to the ending where Luster Dawn does become friends. Like, and the main six just look off into the sunset, and I can realize that this is the end. And then we have the book closing, sort of a nice callback to the pilot with the book opening to begin the series. So, again, this is a very solid episode. Now, I will admit that some of it is propped up by the fact that it is the final episode, and that some of this was going to have to happen because it was the final episode, to where I did debate over whether it should be this high on the list. I kind of view it similarly to a lot of two-parters in that a lot of those episodes benefit from the fact that they are more special episodes, that they do get to culminate a lot of bigger trends that were present throughout previous episodes, and gets to basically profit off like those shows, like building up characters and building up big plot pieces. And this episode is very much in line with that, with it literally being the end of the series, with us like culminating all these characters' arcs over the course of the series and just seeing them being sent off. So I did debate over whether this episode should be high, like, based on its own merits, or whether a lot of it is propped up simply due to it being the final episode. Now, I do feel like it's still a very solid episode. Again, I did decide to have it at least at number 3, but I will admit that the top 2 episodes were more enjoyable, were probably more interesting for me, and definitely stood more on their own, to where I did decide to leave this episode at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I'm sure some people will disagree with this. I know there are people who definitely like this episode, but wouldn't say that it's one of the better ones of the series, but I just love it. But here we have She's All Yak. And I get it. I'm sure plenty of people will note that it's similar to other episodes like Discord and Harmony, and that a lot of it is just your typical be yourself story. And to a degree, it is. Although I feel like there's a bit more going on, where something I've definitely talked about before with other episodes is this theme in later seasons about like basically the ponies coming around to appreciate different cultures better. I mean, a part of the reason why they found the school was an effort to include all these other races and for these people of different backgrounds to really express their traditions and their ways of life rather than just assuming that ponies are superior to all forms of civilization, which admittedly some of the earlier seasons definitely succumb to a degree. But I feel like this episode really hammers that home and really shows some of the downsides of the mindset that was displayed earlier in the series, where we have Yona coming in and her thinking that she needs to completely change herself to be more like a pony. Definitely sort of internalizing this mindset that may have been percolating in the background in earlier seasons, but despite the other ponies trying to counter it as of lately, we do see that they still kind of struggle with it, with Rarity like really helping Yona to try to embrace pony culture, but it's not really from a mean spirited perspective. Rarity herself never seems to accept the idea that yak culture is inferior to pony culture. She really is just doing like what she considers to be fashionable, and she assumes that she's doing what Yona wants her to do, which involves Yona feeling like she needs to embrace pony culture more. And obviously, you do fault Rarity and the other ponies for not realizing that broader mindset, but it's still one that really pervades this episode and really makes what would be a standard be yourself story into something a bit deeper and definitely more interesting, with Yona internalizing this idea that she has to basically act like a pony in order to be accepted and to really appeal to Sambar, who is obviously another pony. And along the way, we get some pretty good stuff. We have a really good song with Fit Right In, which I really love. It's one of my favorite songs from the later seasons. And it's really a shame that literally only 2 years after this episode comes out, we have a new generation having another song with the exact same name that people seem to associate now with that name, and to the point where they completely forget about this one. But I really do love this version of Fit Right In, where it's not only pretty catchy, but also some very interesting visuals with Yona turning herself into a pony. And then we had the puzzle pieces, like recreating the ending of the QD remark. That was a pretty nice visual as well, with it coming together in puzzle pieces. And even outside that, we have plenty of fun scenes of Yona trying to embrace pony culture more, like her trying to articulate properly using Brussels sprouts, only for her to eat the Brussels sprouts. We have her trying to make her own food, but just completely disgusts Pinky and Applejack, and them trying to be nice about it and saying, oh, let's get right to baking. We obviously have the whole dancing sequence with Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash trying to teach her how to dance, but Yona just being completely clumsy. And then we get to the actual dance where Yona is embracing all these things and she's trying really hard to come off as cultured and pony like. We obviously have Silverstream having a very funny reaction to Yona's outfit, saying, "You look weird." And then we have Sambar trying to go about his evening with Yona, but at the same time, like really being confused over what's happening. And then Yona screws up, she makes a huge mess and then runs off, like being really upset that she was unable to like clean up her act. And then we have the nice scene of Sambar and Yona trying to make up and trying to communicate each other. We have Yona's funny gag of her tying herself to the pillar saying, "I'm not leaving," and then immediately asks Sambar to bring her food, which was pretty funny. And then, he talks her down. They go back to the dance, and the main six finally admit that they feel bad for what happened, that they thought they were just trying to teach Yona how to have a good time, and they really only did it because they thought that's what Yona was looking for. And then for all that to just come up short really is interesting in my view. So it's obviously an episode that definitely suffers to a degree. I mean, yes, on the surface, it is just your typical be yourself story. But when you factor in the broader context of what's happening here, about how in the later seasons, like the show is at least making an effort to rectify some of the multicultural issues that pervade some of the subtext, particularly with ponies and their relationship to other species. Just seeing a byproduct of that mindset and seeing the main six coming around to seeing just how flawed that mindset is and how that mindset can actually be pretty harmful is an interesting layer that makes this episode way more interesting to me. And I'm sure some people will say that I'm reading too much into it, but again, at the end of the day, it just makes me enjoy the episode even more. So I feel like that alone makes this one of the more interesting episodes in the series. But with that said, I feel like one episode tops it, which is why I do have it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best episode of season 9 should be very obvious. I mean, this is widely regarded as one of the best episodes of the series, and it is here. But here we have Frenemies, and this is an incredible episode, one that really focuses on each of these villains here that are working with Grogar to try to reclaim their lost glory. But obviously, most of the episode focuses on them really coming around to the idea of friendship and how friendship itself isn't inherently heroic, how it can be used as a tool to promote like cooperation with less savory characters. And we do see Cozy Glow's worldview of friendship being a tool to consolidate power and really maximizes it here with her being able to bond with Chrysalis and Tyrek, while the two of them realize that they can use each other in order to help each other achieve their goals. And they use their hatred of Twilight and their previous encounters of her and being defeated by her as a way of bonding. And it's really interesting seeing all that come together, where on one level, they do sort of become friends by the end of it, and they do sort of work together, and they learn that working together can help them accomplish their goals, even if those goals are evil. But on another level, you can also see how they are being pretty opportunistic with a lot of this, how to a large degree they really are just using each other while still believing that they are superior to each other, and how once they're able to defeat Twilight, how they're going to be able to rise up and really take the reins of their power and really become the sole force in leading Equestria down whatever vision that they have for each other. So there is this interesting double play going on where we have them becoming friends and seeing the value of friendship, but also being very selfish and self-interested to where they aren't changing too much, but they're still learning about friendship in a really believable way to accomplish their goals. So I feel like that alone makes things pretty interesting and really expands upon Cozy Glow's expression of friendship as a source of power way back in season 8, but obviously this is now on a much larger scale. A lot of this episode is also pretty entertaining. Now, admittedly, the weakest part of the episode is the song. I mean, I know a lot of people love the song, How It's Good to Be Bad, but to be honest, that's outside the visuals, like, I don't find it to be the catchiest thing in the world, but still largely gets its point across. And then we get on this quest to get the bell, and we do see a lot of their shenanigans taking place with each of them trying to go about it alone, only to come up short. Cozy Glow is particularly funny, where she is trying to use her looks in order to get people to feel bad for her and to really help her along. But then when she's unable to get through, like when the guard pony is unable to get her across, like she gets really upset and yells so loudly that it causes an avalanche, which is just really funny. And then we have that scene around the campfire where the three of them finally come to terms with the fact that they can't do it alone. And again, they just learned this lesson. And again, that's definitely one of the better scenes in the series. I do love how they are coming together and just seeing how they are coming to these conclusions about friendship. And I always love Chrysalis's Twilight impersonation. That itself is also pretty funny. And then by the end, they are able to work together to get the bell, but then they decide to basically betray Grogar by hiding the bell and making it sound like they just failed to get it. And it is pretty funny how Grogar came into this episode with them thinking that they were just completely incompetent and that they were unable to get the bell. And at the end, for them to act like they still failed the mission, and for Grogar to walk away with the same impression of them about how they're still very incompetent is a pretty interesting dynamic. And obviously, knowing that this is Discord, just seeing how this is the moment where Discord starts to lose control of the situation, how this goes from simply being a test to just outright creating another crisis is pretty interesting as well, again, with that context. So, really, this is a very entertaining episode. It's a pretty important episode for the plot development. It's a very interesting premise with Obviously, all of it focusing on these villains and presenting them in a somewhat sympathetic light, with the three of them learning, being the ones to learn the lesson by the end of it, while still being evil on their own. And again, this is one of the best episodes in the entire series. And I have to put it here at number one. I feel like this is clearly the best episode of the series, and really one of the better episodes from seasons 8 and 9, which a lot of people regard as sort of like the dark age of MLP, sort of like its last whimper and how it was dying. But I feel like this episode alone demonstrates that MLP was still capable of generating top tier episodes even at that point, and this episode is just a testament to that. So I feel like with all that, this is clearly the best episode of season 9, one of the best in the series, and because of that, it is here at number one. And with that, we have wrapped up the season 9 episode ranking, and along with that, all of the season episode rankings. Now, I had a lot of fun in this process. It was definitely a long process, one that took a couple months of just revisiting each of the seasons, getting to talk about them in general, and obviously ranking the episodes within them. And then now we move on to the next step, which is going to be a much bigger project where I'm going to be ranking every single episode onto one list. And it's going to be a lot of fun. This was something I've been building up to for a while now. And it's actually one of the first ideas that I had when I decided to bring back this channel over a year ago at this point. And I'm excited that we're now at the point where we can put that list together. Now, it's going to be a very long process, I'm not going to lie. And it's going to be so long, in fact, that I'm actually going to have to divide it into several parts. So I guess to give you a bit of a preview, I have decided to break down the episode ranking into 4 videos in 4 parts, with part 1 being the top 10 worst episodes in the series, part 4 being the top 10 best episodes of the series, and then parts 2 and 3 basically being everything else in the middle, where I'm probably going to divide it around the 100 mark on the list. So again, it's going to be 4 videos. It's going to be very long regardless. And it'll be fun to just put all these lists together and really determine what the best ones are, what the worst ones are, and what is everything in between, what's going to fall in between. I'm going to have a lot of fun putting together, and I hope you guys will find this as entertaining as well. So stay tuned for that. But there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, we'll be back with similar content moving forward, with the big episode ranking coming along with it. So stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I will leave a link to join in the description. Again, we're going to have a long road ahead of us with this episode ranking, and I hope you guys will be involved. But for now, that is the video. See ya.